Well, shall we open up for questions? Alexis, where are you?
I see we've got lots of questions.
Oh, good.
We have a fair amount of questions. Here are two to kind of kick off our Q&A session. The first is, when you began teaching the Chinese about US law in 1979, were you hoping China would adopt US law? And the second question is for Steve. US lawyers helped lift millions of Chinese out of poverty. It's easy to see how US investment helps with that, but how did law reform help?
Yeah, well, let me take the first question and Steve the second. We were not naive. We did not think we were going to make American lawyers out of Chinese, but they hungered for knowledge. How do you do business with the world successfully? We came from a background, we were then both with a law firm called Couder Brothers, which was a leading international firm, started in Paris and had done enormous post-World War II foreign investment that helped the restoration of the West European economy after World War II. And this is what we knew: international business law. What is a joint venture? Chinese wanted to know that. In March 1979, I ran a one-week program at their request, China Council for the Promotion of International Trade. It was all devoted to what is an equity joint venture. And we had 125 Chinese officials there. They were drafting the joint venture law. And it was clear that despite certain UN experts warning them, beware of foreign investment, China respected what foreign investors had done in many developing countries. And they were confident that if they learned enough before drafting the law and applying it, that they would not allow foreign business to exploit them. So this was a fascinating enterprise. And on July 1st, 1979, we waited with bated breath to see what the Chinese first joint venture law would look like. And this was a product of very sophisticated, enormous Chinese effort in absorbing what foreigners had to say. This wasn't American law, but they had to learn what international practice, which was influenced by American as well as English, French, whatever law, had accomplished. And they knew they had to do it. They were not afraid we were going to Americanize them. And they were hungry to get foreign exchange. I remember when Pan Am opened the first foreign airline to Beijing in December '79, there was a dinner in the Great Hall of the People. The fact that the Chinese leadership decided to rent a room in the Great Hall of the People, the central government site, to foreigners showed their hunger for foreign exchange. And we had a very jolly evening until in the middle of dinner, the tragic news came from New York that John Lennon had just been assassinated. That put a damper on the conversation. Gradually, we went around the big table trying to say something appropriate to the sad news. I sat next to a vice minister of foreign trade who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. When he felt it was he had to say something, he shook his head sadly and said about the late John Lennon, "That man earned a lot of foreign exchange for his country." And that was the atmosphere of the day. And they hungered for what we had. We didn't believe we were going to make Americans or Democrats out of them, but we felt we could give them the tools, the only tools we had for doing what they wanted. And of course, that gave us a chance to learn from them. It was, sometimes it's been said, I was accused of being the leader of a movement to Americanize the Chinese by responding to their request for our help. And of course, that wasn't our intent at all. I was there in order to learn about China. And as they gradually in the 80s put out one regulation, one law after another, I wrote many articles in the China Business Review about each one, commenting about what we had learned and suggesting how they might improve it. And one article was entitled 20 Questions About China's New Joint Venture Law. And later I was told by friends in the Ministry of Foreign Trade in Beijing that I was known as 20 Question Cohen. Well, we weren't trying to Americanize them, we were trying to be helpful.
Jerry, do you recognize what I've put up here?
I can't see all of it, Steve.
Let's see.
Tell us what that is.
It's the old FEC certificates.
Foreign exchange certificate.
Yes, foreign exchange certificates, which the Chinese issued to those of us who brought dollars, where you exchange them at a fixed exchange rate, and then were able to use them to buy goods which were otherwise not available to Chinese. So you could buy, or you needed a coupon to draw for a bicycle, a refrigerator, a washing machine, variety of other things where you use those FEC certificates. But it showed how important it was for the Chinese to bring that foreign exchange in. I mean, today, obviously, they've got these massive surplus. Way back then, they had massive deficits. I still remember, this is after I'd left the practice of law. I was between then and Lehman Brothers, I was shipping goods into China, including 19-inch colored televisions made by Samsung and shipped into China, because the Koreans didn't have relations with the Chinese. So we were able to intermediate that and make a few dollars. And we did it through back-to-back letters of credit. And China had such a foreign exchange crisis. My recollection, this was 1984, that they defaulted on the letter of credit that we had had. So we couldn't pay our suppliers, which created an incredible problem. And when I went in to see them, I said, I'm a lawyer, you can't default on a letter of credit. This is ridiculous. They said, don't worry, we'll pay you in 6 months. We just don't have the money then. Well, IBM and Mitsubishi and can wait, but Steve Orleans can't. So it was really one of the interesting legal crises in my life. Foreign investment is much more than just for the profits. For U.S. investment, foreign investment in China has really lifted, not only has it helped lift Chinese out of poverty, it's raised the standards for Chinese businesses. That what we did in those early years is we set environmental standards, labor standards, other standards that became the standards for other companies in China. That if you went to a joint venture, you kind of said, wow, or Chinese went to a joint venture, they say, wow, their standards of operation are so much higher than ours. So we indirectly really helped raise the standards for all businesses across China. We also, what I think we did is we created constituencies in China that were pro-constructive relations between the United States and China. So when I think of the people that I worked with in those years, they became constituencies for constructive U.S.-China relations. Some might call them, pro-American, but in fact, what they were pro-good relations between the United States and China, because people who worked with us came to understand America and our values through us. That in a lot of ways, we were like people's ambassadors for the United States, ambassadors for our values, ambassadors for our law, ambassadors for our regulations. We didn't believe we were going to convert China into an American system, but we did believe that we were going to create people who were basically pro-constructive engagement and to some degree pro-Americans. Many of them ended up sending their children to the United States to study. They ended up being people who kind of stood for good relations with the United States.
I should add one qualification to what we said about not foisting American law on China. China had to have tax legislation. Foreign business was very concerned. The oil companies that wanted to invest offshore China and that China wanted to attract would not make any contract with China unless they could credit against their American income tax every tax dollar they paid to China. In order to do that, they had to have the approval of the American Treasury Department. And to get that, they had to draft legislation that was deemed appropriate, creditable. And the Chinese Ministry of Finance, State Tax Bureau, asked me, could we help them do that? And I remember in December '78, even before I left Harvard to go to Hong Kong and then Beijing, after 25 years of failing to answer the Harvard Law School International Tax Program's annual invitation to send somebody or some bodies to take part in the annual training program for tax officials all over the world, China finally sent a reply. And I loved it because the state tax department head, Mr. Liu Zhicheng, who later became a good friend, he wrote a letter in Chinese to Harvard, which Professor Oldman, with excitement, came into my Harvard office and showed me. And it said, you know, we've been thinking about your offer for some time, and we finally decided to accept it. How do we do it? And that's how they invited me to come to Beijing to talk about how do you train tax officials, and above all, how do we get tax legislation this spring? Because the leadership of the party was insisting that the ministry come up with suitable tax laws. And we did help them through a 6-week summer seminar in Dalian that summer that led to legislation that ultimately did pass muster with our tax authorities. And I say with some pride, I was the first individual income taxpayer in the United States to take a tax credit based on the tax I had to pay to China. Well, let's go on to the second question, Steve.
Alexis is reading the questions. Go ahead.
All right, so here's two more. Question.
Did we answer the second question that was asked?
Yes, I think Steve answered it for us.
Okay.
Great. So question number one, is there anything you would do differently if you could go back to 1979 with hindsight? And question two, both of you discussed ways you'd like the People's Republic to change, including human rights policy. Can you take another perspective and discuss whether the Communist Party was able to bring more disadvantaged persons into a greater sense of community than Western democracies have been able to do?
Well, on the second question, certainly there have been some virtues to the Chinese Communist Party system. They have presided over the enormous social as well as economic, political, and other changes that we've talked about. Now, there are questions whether the costs that they have extracted from the Chinese people make the benefits worthwhile. Some people say, well, the KMT dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, if it had not lost the civil war in China, it evolved over time in Taiwan in a very impressive way. And it might well have achieved similar progress once it stopped frustrating the opportunities for the Chinese people to develop without the same costs in terms of human freedom that have been paid in China. But there's no doubt that the current regime has done a lot for at least giving opportunity to many, many people in China who previously would never have had a chance for education or economic advancement or international contact, careers, etc. So it's one of these problems of history. It's hard to answer I don't deny that the current regime has achieved certain benefits for the people of China. That's evident. How much credit to give the regime, how much credit you give to the ability of the regime to release the energies and talents of an extraordinary people. Could another government have done better? All of these are terrific conundrums, but I'd love to hear what Steve thinks.
What would I have done differently? I would have bought property in Shanghai. You know, I always regret not having owned property in Shanghai. The, you know, you know, when I think back to the last 43 years, I would have become a professor at law school. No, it's, you know, in terms of the time at the State Department, you know, I wish when we established diplomatic relations, I mean, the good news and the bad news of it was far too closely held that National Security Advisor Brzezinski, Mike Oxenberg decided that, you know, we as lawyers in the State Department would be given piecemeal questions. You wouldn't be told about the negotiations overall. You kind of say, well, what if we did this? What if we need to do unofficial relations? What if we need to do this? And operating in kind of this siloed world, I think made my job much tougher. And ultimately, when we established diplomatic relations, made it a bumpier road. You know, Senator Helms and others were troubled. And I wish we had somehow done that.
In fairness to them, they were following the precedent Henry Kissinger and Nixon had set.
Absolutely. But it really was, I mean, one of the more terrifying moments of my life was sitting behind my boss, who was the legal advisor in the State Department, watching him being excoriated by the Senate for not having consulted sufficiently on the legal aspects of the establishment of diplomatic relations with China and the establishment of the AIT. I mean, I was 29 years old, being screamed at by senators, even though it was directed at my boss, not at me. It was quite an experience for what I felt like was a recent law graduate.
But the question about more recent years, after that, once we got to China, should we have done some other things, positive or avoiding negative things that we, in retrospect, it would have been better to do differently? That's what it's a very good question, of course, and there's a human tendency to vindicate what one has done in the past. I don't think we had much choice in doing this. Once we wanted to help, once we wanted to be there, once we wanted to learn, this was a terrific opportunity. And we were dealing with a liberal communist leader, Xiaoyan, who was more liberal than some of the more senior people to him. He was obviously in favor of promoting Beijing, having decided to take a chance on a couple of, or we should say 3 foreign lawyers. I don't want to forget Owen Lee, who joined us and played an important part in our efforts and later has taught at both Columbia and NYU. But this was a controversial thing for them to do, and they didn't trust us entirely. I offered our help in advising China and negotiating with foreign companies, but they couldn't get clearance for that. It was all too early. But whenever Shanghai, well, they once let me go to Shanghai and give some lectures, but whenever Guangzhou or other cities asked me to come down, Beijing didn't want it. There was the kind of competition that we've seen among our states competing with each other for attracting foreign investment. Maybe I should have pushed harder against Beijing's desire to monopolize our talents, but I don't think of anything serious.
Yeah, I mean, Xiaoyang was a remarkable person, that he would take the risk. And I don't think I realized back then in 79, 80, 81, what an enormous risk it was for him to take to sponsor you, me, and Owen Nee. That it was, you know, I still remember the Sifabu coming to visit the office one day and saying, "You guys are here practicing law. You can't do that." And I kind of said, "No, we're here teaching." And they left, and I quickly called Lao Sun and said, "We just had a visit from the Sifabu." And he said, "不管他, you know, just ignore them. 我们是北京市. We're Beijing municipality. We don't report to the Sifabu." And it really was they were remarkably brave. I regret not having spent more time with Xiaoyang, you know, that he went on to obviously become party secretary of Chongqing and then governor of Sichuan. And I felt I didn't take advantage of every opportunity. And that kind of reminds me of how much China has changed. When the first time, at least the first time I went to Xiaoyang's house for dinner, it's the first time I ever went to a Chinese person's home, he had to get approval from the mayor of Beijing for me to have that dinner. So think about the interactions we have today with Chinese. I mean, it's simply night and day. It's a different country. That the ability to interact with Chinese, no matter how constrained it may be with a dissident or with a lawyer, it's infinitely better than it was back in 1979 and 80.
Well, I remember trying to take part in legal education, which was just renewing after a 20-year or so absence. And that wasn't easy and usually not possible. And even for our official contacts, in order to get invited to their home for lunch or dinner, I had to get them a fellowship at Harvard Law School. And I remember going to the home of one such favored person, being greeted at the door by his wife, and she looked at me and said, "So this is the person who's breaking up my marriage." It didn't give me much incentive after that. But those contacts were very, Chinese artists were the only ones who didn't fear and didn't seek permission to have social contacts with us in those days. And through my wife, Joan, we often had a chance to get acquainted with Chinese artists who were then not favored, even though 10 years later, they became sometimes politically favored and often quite well-to-do. So human contact is crucial.
Yeah, and you know, again, the approval process, the fact that when we left Beijing, when Jerry, Owen, and I left Beijing, if we weren't leaving the country, we needed a Lu Xingzhen. We needed a travel certificate in order to allow us to go outside of, I believe it was 25 miles of center Beijing. So people today don't remember that was the case for those of us who were first in China after the establishment of diplomatic relations.
Yes, of course, similar restrictions have been imposed by our government on people who were deemed to be effective servants of the Chinese government. That raises another interaction point. Have we answered those questions, Alexis? Are we?
Yes, I think we're ready for our next batch. Here are a few more. Question 1, do you think trade sanctions helps or undermines legal reform and building the legal system? That's question number 1. Question 2, yesterday's historically first telephonic oral argument before the US Supreme Court was blocked in China, according to a number of lawyers there who used the word censorship. Why do you suppose that happened? What harm could it do the interests of China to allow people there to listen?
Well, that second question is a great question. I didn't know the Chinese had blocked it. I'm not surprised, because any knowledge of how a free legal system operates is now considered subversive. And it's not only blocking knowledge, but distorting the Chinese people's image of what takes place abroad. That makes our attempts for further understanding more difficult. So it isn't only censorship, it's even fake news and manipulation of their perception. That's a big question. But I'm delighted to hear that, and we should make something of it. And I'm glad that the Supreme Court, having finally been forced by circumstance to open up its own proceedings for transparency, has had an immediate impact on China. That's wonderful. I hope the Chief Justice, who's opposed greater transparency for the Supreme Court arguments, is aware of that. That's great.
You know, the question on trade sanctions and whether that helps legal reform gets to one of my basic points, which is, it's funny, when I first heard the beginning of the question, I thought you were going to talk about first of its kind speech in Chinese by a senior U.S. government official. I thought it was going to be what you know, that obviously was blocked, but Matt Pottinger, in what I thought was very clear Chinese, gave a speech that talked about the May 4th movement's relevance to today. I think its message, however, was, you know, the Chinese Communist, the people of China need to rethink the Chinese Communist Party's rule, and the way some of the intellectuals in the May 4th movement tried to create free expression. They took a portion of what they said and said, this is what the Chinese people need to do today. I think that, whereas I think it is fabulous that a US official gives a speech in Chinese. I think that is great. I mean, because I see Chinese I see Cui Qiankai, Zhou Wenzhong, so many Chinese ambassadors and senior officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs talk directly to the American people in English. I think it's wonderful that Matt sought to use Chinese to convey a message. I disagree with the message. And I think that relates to the trade sanctions question, in that if we are advocating, if we are advocating changes in rule of law, and the Chinese Communist Party thinks our desire is to overthrow the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, do you think they're going to take our recommendations seriously, or going to throw them out saying, yeah, this is an attempt to undermine the CCP? I think the answer is they will not accept those recommendations. If we're talking about diplomatic and economic competition, if we accept, I mean, that the CCP is going to rule China until the Chinese people decide it's time for a change, but in the interim, there are areas where reforms benefit the Chinese people, that China has signed on to all of these international conventions. Live up to those conventions. If you're making that argument, I think you're going to be much more successful. I think the sanctions, the entity list, the financial sanctions we put on, the blocks on Huawei, simply don't have the desired effect, because the Chinese sit there and say, this is just America's attempt to contain us. This isn't about a violation of Iran sanctions. This is not a violation of North Korea's sanctions. It's just a legal excuse to contain China. So we're not going to follow what you're going to do. So I think it's a good question, and you know, it doesn't help.
I would have a couple of comments. Steve, a couple of times you've mentioned we have to leave it to the Chinese people, but we have to recognize the obstacles for the Chinese people to say what they'd like. We're living in a time when we've never seen a more efficient repression of the opportunity to express sentiments different from those that the Communist Party insists on. So how do the Chinese people decide their own fate? That's the question. What do they have to do? Go into the streets and risk the kinds of punishment that June 4th, 1989 inflicted on people in Beijing? What can be done?
What you see is, when issues arise, when incidents, I mean, unfortunately, we no longer see the publication of the number of, what they call, quote, mass incidents that have occurred in China. There is protest, there is demonstration. The CCP goes and investigates what has happened. Obviously, they crack down on the leadership, and then they try to engage in some level of reform. So the Chinese the Chinese people begin to understand what line can and cannot be crossed and whether it's worth it or not. Obviously, it's not ideal, but the system is able to kind of suppress protest while at the same time responding to concerns.
What about sanctions for human rights violations? We have this increasing application of the so-called Magnitsky Act that enables the United States to take sanctions against officials who are deemed to be responsible for human rights violations. Now, to me, the problem with it ultimately is, in China, we know who's responsible for human rights violations. Can you punish even the top official in Xinjiang by not letting him come to the US or not letting him have property in the US and not punish his boss? We know the buck stops with Xi Jinping, yet no one advocates trying to impose sanctions upon Xi Jinping for his responsibility for the many human rights violations in China.
Yeah, the issue is its effectiveness.
Yeah.
We tried in 1993, after President Clinton was elected, to link specific human rights criteria to granting of MFN, and it failed. Again, my belief is that we end the strategic competition. We advocate that these violations are ultimately not in the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. That ultimately this is going to create a situation which is going to undermine the rule. Now, will it happen this year, next year? Don't know. Will it ultimately happen? History tells us that those kinds of regimes run into problems at some point. So you advocate reform in a way that kind of brings the Chinese with you, brings the Chinese Communist Party with you. But obviously their primary goal is to stay in power. And they believe, you have the issues of like explaining the situation in Hong Kong. You explain that allowing rule of law to continue gives the people an outlet, that people still believe that when that erodes, ultimately it makes the situation less, not more tenable.
Of course, if you do give the people an outlet protected by the rule of law in Hong Kong, it sets obvious continuing precedent for the rest of China. And that seems to be feared by the party also. Well, let's get on, Alexis. We still have about 14 minutes. How about some more questions?
Sure. I think we've got time for about 2 to 3 more questions. Here's question 1. What are your views about MFN and PNTR that delinked human rights trade with China? Can we say it was wrong? And then question 2, it's a combination of sort of a comment and a question. Question 2, both speakers have made comparisons with Cold War relations between the US and USSR. They are now serious legal historians looking closely at the development of international law and institutions during the Cold War. Can you two say more about how Cold War relations between the US, USSR differ from today's US-China relations? Was the US right to see the USSR as an existential threat and, as Steve argues, wrong to see China the same way now? Or is the difference today that the world is no longer defined by bilateral relations between two superpowers, or are other differences between the two eras so that the Cold War lessons can be drawn only apply with respect to distinct issues like the threat to national security involving cyber issues that don't apply to other issues, for example, economic cooperation and trade products?
Those are very sophisticated questions, especially the second one. We could give a whole seminar on that. On the first one, Steve made an allusion to that before. Until the PRC entry into the WTO issues arose, there used to be an annual congressional review of whether, because of human rights violations in the PRC in China, China should be denied equal access to the American market. And that always exerted enormous pressure on China to curb, to at least a modest extent, some of its more blatant human rights violations. But what I noticed, of course, and I was taking an active part in some of these human rights questions, was it often, as the time for congressional approval of one more year of access to the American market came, China would release a few prisoners whose detention had been controversial. Then they would get the approval, then they'd lock up many more. So it helped specific cases. I myself benefited from that to the extent of I was able to get some people out of jail in China because of Chinese awareness that otherwise it might create problems with the Congress. I remember when the question of WTO entry required congressional approval, which would have meant the end of the annual review of China's access to our market. When this came up and the Chinese were arbitrarily detaining the Chinese librarian of Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, I was able to recruit Senator Arlen Specter, who was in charge of the State Department budget and the Senate subcommittee that was relevant, to join me. And we made it clear in various ways to the Chinese that Senator Specter was going to introduce a bill against WTO entry for China unless Song Yong-yi, who was not an American citizen, but did have green card status and worked in Pennsylvania at Dickinson, was released from prison. And that worked, very promptly worked after a few weeks of effort. But it didn't stop further repression against other people. So I never regarded that threat as so worthwhile compared to the benefits that might accrue from China's participation in the WTO. Of course, as Prime Minister Zhu Rongji foresaw, if China proved flexible enough to make all the concessions required for its entry, WTO entry would help the economy flourish. Now, many people criticize us for allowing China to enter the WTO. But I think in terms of the trade-off, I'm a great believer in Chinese government and Chinese people participation in the world that goes back to the 1971 decision to allow the PRC in the UN. I was in favor of diplomatic relations in '79 and the opening of economic cooperation. And I believe it still was the right thing to let China into the WTO despite certain disappointments. And one has to point out again, this is interactive. It's the US that's frustrating the WTO operation now by not approving the appointments required for the dispute resolution process to continue to function. So it isn't only one-sided here. We have to keep our eyes on interaction. Now we come to the much more complex question about what is there to learn from our experience with the Soviet Union. I'm a great believer generally that there's an enormous amount to be learned about contemporary China, even today China, because of its Soviet origins, because of the important impact of the Soviet system on which Chairman Mao, more or less at different times, developed the PRC system. Of course, the Chinese leadership today doesn't want to mention the Soviet Union in any prominent way because the Soviet Union proved a loser. And this was an enormous challenge for the PRC. And they're constantly studying why the Soviet Union collapsed, what role US relations with the Soviet Union played, and how to avoid a similar fate. First thing to point out here is that this is a much stronger China than the Soviet Union ever was. The Soviet Union proved a giant in terms of nuclear weapons for reasons we could go into, but the Soviet Union never had the strength of the Chinese economy today, the Chinese political system. I'm among those who think that the Chinese system today is more fragile, as Susan Shirk pointed out years ago, and I think the evidence continues. Underneath its prowess, I think China has a weaker system because of the innate difficulties of the Communist Party system. But I'm in a minority, I think. But we're facing, in any event, a much stronger China than we ever faced in the Soviet Union, even though China is much less of a threat in terms of nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union was, despite the occasional broadcast of a Chinese military figure about they now can wipe out Los Angeles. So this is a much more complex system, but there's a lot to learn from our experience with the Soviet Union. And we used to have sophisticated arms control.
We're going to run out of time, Jerry.
I want to give you a chance. I'd like to see arms control discussions with the Chinese of a similar nature. And Steve, you may want to say a word about what the National Committee has been doing in terms of encouraging important contacts.
Well, couple of, I think we answered the PNTR MFN question earlier. I mean, I think the issue is that the relationship is much broader than just human rights. So I think the Clinton administration made a decision that it wasn't having the effect that we wanted. The other is something which actually we learned in the early days, and partly through my study of China, is our ability to influence results within China are unfortunately limited. That we may want a certain result, but when you live there and you see the complexity of China, you see what's going on, you realize that our ability to affect it is on domestic issues is really quite limited. I think the Soviet Union analogies are overstated. We do not have a policy, nor should we have a policy of containment, which gets back to my fundamental point, which is China does not pose an existential threat to the United States. And we need to realize that as opposed to the Soviet Union, where we had the Cuban Missile Crisis and other events where they were aiming weapons at us, the Chinese are not interested in that. And kind of the study of Chinese history tells you, China at 1.4 billion people is inwardly focused. I mean, I remember a conversation I had with the Chinese National Security Advisor, which I think was very illuminating and symbolic. He said, this was during the Obama administration, President Obama gets up in the morning and he's briefed on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Venezuela, on Somalia. President Xi gets up in the morning and he's briefed on Sichuan, Xinjiang, Guangzhou. He's briefed on what has gone on in China. The threat arrows in China are inward. In the United States, we see them as outward. And to the extent that we understand that, we need to craft policies which do not heighten this strategic competition, which do not create this false narrative of the strategic competition. Because what has happened now, what has happened today is the strategic competition, in my view, has paved the way for the coronavirus to decimate China and the United States. What we saw, because of this strategic competition, we saw the CDC of the United States reduce its presence in China from 47 people in 2017 to 11, because scientific cooperation was inconsistent with this strategic competition. And what we saw is the Chinese went on January 6th, our Secretary of HHS asked the Chinese, we will help and send experts from CDC. The Chinese viewed this as a way to undermine China because of this strategic competition. And it wasn't until February 10th that Americans from CDC went as part of the WHO mission. So what has happened? Now, you can't know for sure if this CDC reduction helped pave the way, but boy, it sure sounds like. We used to have an epidemiologist in Beijing until July of last year. The position got ended. So these two actions by both governments, because of this strategic competition, have basically injured the peoples of both of the countries. It's the consequences that we're going to have by not cooperating with China on economic crisis, on pandemics, on terrorism, on climate change, far outweigh the conflicting interest. We can find ways to make sure that the strategic competition does not cause enormous problems in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, with Taiwan, in Hong Kong. But the way we're approaching it is so counterproductive that it breaks my heart, that I watch this every day. And Jerry says, well, what does the National Committee do? We do lots of programs like this. We do lots of public programs. We continue to talk to the Chinese. We continue to do our 6-track 2 dialogues with the Chinese, now on Zoom. But we can only have, just as I said, we can only marginally affect what the Chinese government does. We can only marginally affect what the US government does. And we're on such a wrong path that it's really tough every day to figure out what to do.
That's a great final statement, ending with concern for our coronavirus crisis as we began. Steve, thanks a lot. This was a very fascinating discussion.
Great fun.